الجلسة الثالثة عشر والتي انتهت قبل قليل كانت بعنوان الإدماج الحضري للمدن. فشكرا لكل المشاركين بهذه الجلسة، وعلى رأسهم صاحبة السمو الملكي الأميرة هيفا الفيصل، وشكرا لرئيسة الجلسة الدكتورة سمية السليمان، ولسعادة الدكتورة حصة الغزال، والمهندس محمد البحراني، والدكتور زياد أعظم على إثرائهم لهذا المنتدى بهذه المشاركة القيمة. الآن نبدأ الجلسة الرابعة عشر والتي هي بعنوان عمارة الإنسانية، ويترأس هذه الجلسة الدكتور عدنان عدس، الأستاذ المشارك بكلية تصاميم البيئة بجامعة الملك عبد العزيز، فليتفضل.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. ضيفنا البروفيسور هاني رشيد، نعم هو من أصل عربي لكنه هاجر إلى الغرب وعمره 3 سنوات، ولذا ستكون المحاضرة باللغة الإنجليزية لأنه هو يحمل الجنسية الكندية الأمريكية، وأنا حأتحول إلى اللغة الإنجليزية لأعطي نبذة بسيطة عن البروفيسور هاني رشيد. He's the co-founder of highly acclaimed New York-based architecture practice and urban design by the name of Asymptote Architecture. Professor Hani Rashid, with his partner in the office, has many award-winning design projects around the globe, well known in the architecture world. Projects such as the new Hermitage Museum of Contemporary Art, also very close project, yes, Viceroy Marina Hotel in Abu Dhabi, the ING Bank headquarter building in Ghent, Belgium, and also many other projects that really there is no time. I would leave Professor Rashid to talk about. On the other hand, he has also a very distinguished academic career in architecture. Professor Hani is a visiting professor in many of the world's leading architecture schools, such as the SciArc in Los Angeles, California, Berlage Institute in Amsterdam, ETH in Zurich, and also in Columbia and Princeton. Currently, Professor Hani is the director of graduate program in the University of Vienna of Fine Art. I give you Professor Hani Rashid.
Shukran. Can we put the slides up? It's a pleasure to be here. My father would have liked me to have presented this in Arabic, my late father, but unfortunately I had an English mother, so I spoke English at home. I wanted to basically talk about humanizing cities under these 5 categories in terms of our work and how we are in fact working in urbanism in cities and in the future of architecture. The first subject here is, and I see some spelling errors, edge making. And I think what I want to talk about here is the idea that in building cities we have edges. We have the outlying components of the city that delineate or define a city. And for us, projects that we've had in the office that have helped us understand that and work towards producing an interesting edge condition are in fact port terminals for cities that in fact exist on the water. This is a project we had done in Taiwan for Keelung. The project started as these kind of sketches or these drawings for the edge of the city and how in fact a port terminal might be notated and terminated and produce a kind of urban condition at the very edge of the city. The building was designed to sit as a kind of in a strong relation to ships coming in and docking with the building. So the architecture would somehow evoke the the beauty and the poetry and the power of nautical architecture in a single sort of entity that would somehow work in unison musically with the ships moving in and out of the port. The building also is a kind of celebration of urbanism at the edge of the city. In this case, we produced a sports complex, a velodrome for cycling events and other things that would somehow not just have a functional building at the edge as a kind of port, but also a building that would be a public building, a spectacle building, a building of events and structures, so people could arrive and in fact have a kind of affection for the building, a kind of understanding of the building as part of their city and part of their being and part of their existence in a kind of interesting way. The interior of a building like this for a port terminal is in fact very utilitarian, and in our case we had gone to great lengths to make it very public, producing a kind of internal streets that would take you up into the various components and the more of the sort of prosaic and functional aspects of the building. So inside the building is in fact the public street in fact winds straight into this facility, and you can see in this image that on the You can see in this image that on the left, on your left, is the circulation system that in fact moves through the building to take people on a functional level in and out of the port. But on the right is a public street full of art galleries, some retail, but mostly cultural institutions and cultural aspects to produce a kind of living, spiraling urbanism that goes up into this building and moves around through its interior. So on the upper level, this is the actual waiting hall. So the waiting hall looks into the city. The city is in fact extracted and brought into the building. And at the very center of the building is a massive sort of space about this size that in fact is a tropical rainforest. And the forest is put into the interior of the building, both as a reminder of the area. Keelung is in fact surrounded by tropical rainforests, but also becomes a natural cooling system for the building, doing what nature does best, which is cool air and deal with and oxygenate air, and drives that into the building. So here you see the relationship between the functional aspects of the building, the atrium and the tropical rainforest, and the actual functional aspects of the building, the machining of the building. And all of this produces a very functional, important building for Keelung that is not only a sort of transit center for moving back and forth on the ships, but also a place to celebrate the city's urbanism. At the ground level as well, there's a kind of celebration of the urbanism in what is by day a parking structure, becomes by night night markets and a very active area under the velodrome. And here you can see the relationship of the city to the building. The building is lifted, the city slips under the building, through the building, and activates the underbelly. And then the interior botanical garden and sort of a tropical rainforest. Here you can see it from the top, and you can see the relationship of that aspect of the building to the rest of the architecture. So it becomes a sort of central point. And then the building itself produces a kind of an iconic presence in the city of Keelung with a rooftop sort of restaurants and clubs and so on that look out over the harbor. So the building covers urbanism and edging urbanism on three very important points. One is it's a public building with public functions, not just a utilitarian building. It has a architectural sort of assembly and poetry about it that becomes unique to the place. And then it has a kind of iconic presence in the city and becomes a kind of gateway. Similarly, we're doing another port terminal in Miami. And in Miami is, of course, very different than Taiwan. And here the strategy was similar in some respects in the idea of producing a kind of iconic edge building, but also perhaps playing up something more in the American context, more to do with Miami. Miami is a place of different sorts of, let's say, worships, and so this becomes a more a different kind of architecture for that edge condition. And this is a different kind of edge. The edge in Miami tends to be, whereas in Taiwan it was more almost nationalistic in the sense of moving people back and forth through Taiwan and China and into that part of the world. This is more touristic, and this is a touristic building for a big shipping company that produces tours. So this is the roofscape of the building. The building's roof is in fact based on the mathematics and again poetry and architecture of the movement of liquid, of seascapes, evoking that sort of poetry. It's also, of course, similar to sand dunes, which also act the same way as water does mathematically. And then here you see the sort of building edge. And a key part of this building was the spectacle aspect, because in fact it's more of an entertainment building, because it's more of a tourist-driven architecture. The idea was to in fact play up with a live facade that would continually sort of light and change according to the branding of the Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines, and then produce a kind of constant changing set of effects on the edge of Miami. So this building is very much a kind of celebration of that on the water side. And on the city side, in fact, it acts more functionally in terms of tourism and people moving back and forth. It doesn't open up the way the Taiwan project does to producing a kind of urban park at the edge, but rather cleans up the edge with this kind of functional aspects. And here you see the sort of areas for the way these cruise terminals have to function, much like airports, of course. And then the sort of logic of the building itself is this sort of outlay of the facade you just saw, the actual structural system that holds this sort of mathematically complex roof, the interior halls, and then the others sort of utilitarian aspect of the building on the functioning side. And again, the hall here is a sort of celebration of public space. I think what's important to think about when designing buildings for cities is that cities exist, for buildings in a way, and that buildings themselves need to somehow become a kind of encapsulated or contained urbanism. The more we think of public space, both outside and inside, as having a kind of symbiotic relationship, the better off our cities are and the better off our architecture is. So this is the interior kind of urbanism of the transit hall of the Miami Port Terminal. And this is the lower level of that building. And so these become sort of celebratory, awe-inspiring spaces. One of the things that I was very sort of obsessed with in designing this building and the previous one was that the sort of the romance of moving through gateways at the edges of cities, the idea of leaving a city or coming into a city, much like your airport here or any major airport in the world. These are important places, both as kind of the first things you see when you land somewhere, of course. They're the calling card of the city, but they're also remarkably important places when you leave. And we've sort of lost that with the kind of design of these kinds of buildings centered around retail and shopping centers and sort of efficiency and security. Many things have had an impact on that. And this is a 21st century terminal. It's not an airport, but at least for shipping, which has all the same security issues and drivers, but with a desire to make human, urban, exciting environments. Cultural identity is the second thing that I think that's important to think about when it comes to thinking about cities as being humanized. Cities have to have and are, they are cultural entities in and of themselves, of course. Cities are culture, and culture is derived out of cities, of course, derived out of cities. But museums tend to be our, let's say at least in Europe and everywhere now, of course, in fact, are in fact the sort of cathedrals and sort of houses of worship of our time. We produce museums in all major cities. There's a remarkable one by Jean Nouvel just finished in Dubai. There are, of course, museums. One thinks of the Pompidou in Paris, or the Met in New York, or the MoMA. So every city has a kind of museum, and this is Budapest, and designed for a modern art museum in Budapest. The park, which is a different kind of edge in cities, is the location for this project. And so therefore the cultural buildings, placing a cultural building on that interior or secondary layer of edge being the park, urbanism was key to this project. Here you see the sort of early models of the buildings. It's a historic museum in the front for sort of history of Hungarian art, and then a contemporary art center on the park itself, the way we had divided it, at least in our scheme. And this is sort of the planning, the contemporary art center here, and the more traditional museum spaces in the first building. And the connection of these two buildings across the park and the circulation system to get you from the museum that's on the urban side, the city side, and take you out to the park side where there's the contemporary art center. And so in studying the elevations and the architecture, again, the idea of building a sort of powerful statement that is part of the human condition, let's say, of the city was key here. So on the park side is a kind of a sort of almost a mirrored sort of a building that sort of takes nature and deforms it into sort of certain beautiful sort of structures and artistic aspects. And on the city side is more of a volumetric architecture, which plays off a little bit in a very contemporary way the historic aspects of the city of Budapest, which is a very beautiful city, in fact, much like Vienna. Here you see the city side of the building, the entrance to the museum itself, the various aspects of the museum, the galleries, the public halls, the public spaces, all kind of articulated on the street facade. And then on the park side, along with the landscaping, this more abstract, ethereal, somewhat almost, again, sort of atmosphere-like building on that side. And then the actual quality of the architecture there, the spill out of the slippage of the park into the lower aspects of the Contemporary Art Center, the Contemporary Art Museum above, the theater hanging over the park, and then the kind of, let's say, combination and sort of music of this building sitting within the park setting and within the Budapest setting. It becomes a highly sculptural building and a highly kind of articulated building, but a building of note in the sense that it's recognizable as being the Contemporary Art Center for Budapest and for Hungary, and having a kind of status or status as a sort of top-tier museum on the world map. At the moment, we're also building this building in Russia for the Hermitage Museum. The Hermitage Museum, as you might know, is located in St. Petersburg. They have a pretty interesting and substantial modern art collection, which they've rarely shown, which they'll be bringing to Moscow and housing in our building. And the idea is to build a state-of-the-art contemporary museum for Moscow. This was the first sketch for the building, and in a way, in producing a kind of cultural icon or a sort of magnet in the city, again, a sort of modern cathedral, you could say, the thought was to sort of play off some of the Russian history in modern art. And in fact, Elizitsky's Pround spaces were a big part of this idea. And to produce a sort of a kind of highly functional museum with extremely functional galleries and spaces that curators and visitors would really enjoy and be comfortable in, but at the same time produce a kind of spectacular architectural feature. In the history of contemporary museums and cities, there's always been a bit of a disjunctive moment where they're not necessarily fitting the context or fitting what's expected. This very, very famous project by Piano and Rogers, in fact, did just that. It almost seemed like a spaceship had landed in Paris at the time. And yet today is probably one of the most recognizable and grafted in aspects of Parisian urbanism that one can think of. And so keeping that in mind, this is the context that we have in Moscow. It's a very different context. Modern buildings, a large boulevard, a boulevard that has an amazing history tied back to constructivist lore, constructivist history, because in fact it's the ZIL factory site where the constructivists had looked at from 1919 as the place of the future. In fact, Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera was shot. A lot of the filming was shot in this ZIL area, but now it's being replaced by all of this contemporary building. We started the museum design not necessarily thinking about doing, let's say, a kind of architectural monument, but rather as a kind of phenomenological building. We started with Solowit's works. These are Solowit's sculptures. Solowit had done a lot of work around, obviously, around mathematical, Cartesian mathematical sort of entities, but also both in 2D and 3D. And we were particularly fascinated by Lewitt's plays on cubes and on mathematics of the cubes. So we produced our own sort of models in the office that were sort of taking apart Solowit's work and trying to understand how we could produce a sort of almost the link between Solowit and the constructivists and try and produce a kind of playful, lyrical architectural assembly. The building, again, because of this mandate that we put on it to be at once highly functional but also highly impacting visually and spatially, began to be planned this way. It began with a number of wings for contemporary art. What you're seeing here, in fact, is the wings stacked, the lower wings being modern art, the higher ones being contemporary art and experimental art and so on. And that allowed us to really start to look very carefully at how galleries could be created that would be able to contain work in containers, but then the interface between those galleries became really the key thing to making the architecture important. So the circulation system in this building acts a little bit like a Pround space, if you know what that is. It moves in what we call the Z direction. It's not a kind of there's no atrium as you have, let's say, in the Guggenheim in New York, or even in the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi as planned by Frank Gehry. But rather the circulation is through the galleries themselves as a kind of thread that takes you up through the building. In fact, we designed this building based on time, not on space. We decided that we should really work on a museum that would take a certain amount of time on a kind of average, and we would sort of design the entire experience around a timeline. The case of the building, the sort of shroud, the kind of container, became really important as the way to interface between these functional spaces and the architectural urbanism in the city. So here you see the sort of dissection of the building. This is the second floor above all the vaulted spaces and the secure zones. The ground floor, where that orange sculpture is an 18-meter high space that brings you into the corner of the building off the main boulevard. And on that floor, you can see also some restaurants, cafes, bookstores, and other things that are located on the ground floor. So again, here the key thing is that the urbanism of the city literally makes its way into the building, and the city, the building itself, becomes a microcosm or a micro-urbanism within the city. As you go up to the second level, there's the Hermitage head offices and pedagogical center and so on. And then we get to the modern art galleries on the third floor, which are in fact all designed around the modern collection of the Hermitage, which dates from 1864 to 1919. And then we have the contemporary art spaces above that, and these are 12-meter high spaces that are for the showing of contemporary art. And then we have experimental video and electronic art above that. And then the building is encased in a structural system that helps hold up all these cantilevered volumes and capped with my little ode to Malevich, which is really the heating and ventilation systems up on the top of the building, hovering above. So here you have a sense of what we get. Because the idea was that the building is really a kind of urban entity that allows the city to be basically pulled into its internal organs. The facade itself is a double skin of glass that becomes a sort of becomes a thermal barrier that in fact helps cool the building in the summer and heat it in the winter. But it becomes also a sort of optical, has a set of optical effects that it produces with the existing galleries inside, and produces this kind of crystalline, somewhat mystical, atmosphere-like facade. And this is the kind of power of this building that we want to get, is that it's in fact under a constant state of change, that the spectacle here is not necessarily formalism and architectural sort of bravado, but rather a kind of phenomenological set of occurrences with light and space and occupancy, because as the building changes its occupancy, it also changes its skin. And here you see the ground floor and the roof, which in fact is the place where the mechanical systems are turned into a kind of sculptural entity above. And here's the experience on the roofscape of the sculpture garden. And the interior spaces, the move from the lobby space up to the pedagogical center and then you take that escalator on the right, on the left, and go up to the galleries. And the ground floor, which is a kind of urban space again, that becomes this sort of powerful entry and location, in fact, in the Moscow context for encounters, for meetings, for public realm. It's as secure-free a zone as we can possibly get in the current climate. And then some of the details. This is what I affectionately call the anatomical theater, which is a theater, a sort of public voice theater on the corner of the building that is open to the public to basically give speeches and to see performances and so on, and is not part of the admission to the museum, but is in fact in the public realm. And then on the city side, you can see the way the building is in fact sitting on the boulevard. And then in this image, we did so many simulations of this building under different lighting conditions, and this is one of the ones that I found fascinating, is that when the sun shines in Moscow, which is not that often, there's a kind of a reflectivity off the building that produces almost an opaque quality to it. So the building goes in a way from being an opaque entity in the city to a transparent, almost transparent entity through different phases and different sort of qualities of atmosphere and light and weather. Next, form, the idea of giving form to the city, and form is very important, of course, for us as architects, but it's also important for the city as a way to see itself as urbanism. And this is another project in Moscow that we're doing for a tower. It's near the museum. In fact, you can see the museum is just over there on the right in this conceptual model. And this project for a tower was, again, the usual problem in cities is that we build towers sort of almost as if they're kind of statements of developers and their kind of egos. But we wanted to sort of harken back to the history of this site, to this industrialization, the early industrial revolution for Russia, and started working on these volumes that are very sort of sculptural, highly articulated and quite robust. And this was actually the first model for the tower, that it would be a residential tower in the ZIL property. And then as we worked on it through many, many iterations, we began to sort of fine-tune it to have more of a machinistic quality, that it would almost feel like it was a tooled instrument, and that we would bring this idea of a cube up into the horizon line, above the horizon line in Moscow, as a kind of a homage to constructivism. So these are the elevations for the tower. The tower has this kind of fluted architecture, which in fact plays off the light and qualities of the Moscow skyline or the Moscow atmosphere, and you can see it here in the different sort of moments. And then here's the building as it stands in the site. And I think what's really important about this building is that it, again, in terms of giving form and giving place to a city, that a building like this becomes something recognizable and unique to its context. I think that every city, in fact, has the possibility to produce unique architectural sort of qualities if one were to sort of unwrap and sort of look for the DNA of those places in the work. And this building, in a way, was for us very important, that we could somehow find a way to pick up on the historic aspects of this particular place in Moscow, this highly industrialized site, this site that made machines and tools and automobiles and machinery throughout the 20th century, and then produce a kind of, not a sculptural statement, but a sort of poetic mathematical statement around that subject. In Abu Dhabi, we also were doing a tower a few years ago, on Al Raha Beach. And for that project, we used this was very early parametric modeling tool that we had at the time. This is now already 8 years old, this project. And this tool allowed us to start to think of the building as a sort of evolutionary building in terms of what the program could drive it to become. The dimensions of floor plates, the architecture being the result of a sort of mathematical operation on the massing. So the Al Raha Tower in Abu Dhabi was designed really as a kind of Abu Dhabi's, let's say, the mandate or the program was to give Abu Dhabi something like the Burj Al Arab in Dubai. And we thought that we should probably change this strategy. The Burj in Dubai is a good building. However, the metaphor of the sail and the sort of image of the building being very much about one particular thing, we thought should really be much more abstract. That the building should really speak more about the culture and the place, the phenomena, and again, the sort of DNA of place. So these are the studies of our models for this tower. And this is the Al Raha Tower. The tower is actually very, very beautiful as a result of some of the things that we had done to it. It's a series of double-story apartments, but we had looked at the sort of context and looked at the sort of history in Abu Dhabi and in this part of the world with clothing, with structures and sort of early tent structures and things that would in fact fend off the heat. Sort of produce a building that in fact is almost working with the wind and with the sea air to be a sort of, like the port terminal building, to be a sort of symbiotic building with the local context. The program called for a double helicopter pad on the roof, which was a big problem in the design because we wanted to produce something very, very elegant and very singular. But then going through a lot of work on this, we realized that we could make it sort of part of the quality of the building as it meets the sky and produce a sort of second horizon line and have it sit on the sea in a very powerful way. So the architecture of the roof itself was something that had to be designed, in fact, as one, what we call monocoque piece, because it had to be helicoptered in to cap the building because of the military lines. And also becomes a sort of a kind of, beautiful pearl-like cap to this building. And staying away from what we seem to find too much of, the sort of cliche finishing of buildings with, things that harken back to the Italian Renaissance, even in Asia, for example, or things that are too symbolic. So to really produce an abstract building that stays abstract and that allows people to have their own readings going into the future is really key to part of what I would say a city's humanity is. The base of the building picks up on the seascape and the landscapes to produce these kinds of aerated spaces for the spas and restaurants and all the various pieces. And then you can see how the building sits directly on that and how it in fact is part of the waterscape. So here again, a little bit different definition of edge in the sense of it not being urbanism and public, but private, but still nevertheless being quite powerfully articulated and situated on its condition, and therefore acts in concert with its ground. And this is key to all buildings, I think, that they have to be very, very cognizant of the way in which they meet the city. And this is the interior space, some of the interior spaces of this building. Placemaking is the next subject, and this is really the idea that, looking at the edges of cities and how they in fact are articulated in public, looking at how we produce cultural items within the city or icons or places of sort of let's say attraction, and then places that in fact act in a very public way to produce active conditions and places. Bucky Fuller and this particular image of him standing between his Damaxian car and his geodesic structure, I found really fascinating because in the image is in fact something that I think we're still struggling for in architecture, which is finding a sort of link between technological progress and architectural making and architectural articulation and city making and city space. So the idea that technology is not necessarily only something, as let's say Google projects would like to have it, as something that in fact just gives us data and data that we use in cities, but is also something that can inspire us to produce more beautiful and intelligent architectural outcomes. In our case, again in Abu Dhabi, we were commissioned to, as you know, do the hotel for the centered on the Formula One track for the Yas Marina circuit. And our first inclination to do a building that is centered around speed and movement and the poetry, if you will, or the artistry of Formula One was to look at some things like this. And what I found fascinating about this car, this Red Bull, I think this is Sebastian Vettel's car, was the fact that nothing in this car is designed. This is what this image, at least. This image, the only design in this image is the graphics and the marketing. But the actual architecture of this particular image is, in fact, the engineering of something that works with speed and movement and efficiency. And that became a sort of an idea for building a building. That could the building, in fact, evoke that quality of being a poetic gesture towards the very thing that's being celebrated as a place, as a making a place. So our first sketches, literally sketches for the Yas Hotel, for the Yas Marina, were in fact these computer drawings of pouring a liquid, mercury-like liquid over two hotel structures, crossing the two hotels into the water, into the marina, and crossing the track, and producing a fluid, continual body over the building that would evoke speed, movement, action, and the beauty of sort of both nautical architecture and racing. So this is one of our first computer drawings that were produced to study and see how this shroud, how this casing would in fact work with light, with even with helicopter shots, which is seen a lot during the race, but also with sort of environmental concerns. Because what we realized when we did this, that we were in fact producing a kind of shading device for the building, an envelope that would be part of its environmental story, and so that became really key to the way that the architecture was articulated and designed. So you can see here in this image the sort of controlling and the beginning to design of what ended up being 5,680 diamonds that had to be somehow economically made sense to build, because that would be outrageously expensive, of course, if they were all unique. And so we did a lot of work with parametric modeling tools, with all kinds of sort of mathematical models to see how we could in fact produce this facade and this skin at a relatively good cost and make it relatively efficient and make it environmentally important, sort of key. So with Schley Bergermann, our engineers in Stuttgart, we finally ended up with this envelope, and this envelope rests on 7 points and produces this very, very beautiful and powerful architectural statement in a very light and articulated way. Not many people know this, but when we started the building, there was really all land here, and so part of our project also was to help design the marina and to dredge that marina and to have all of this done in under 21 months. In fact, the whole building was built from our design drawings to completion in 18 months. And here you can see along the way the construction of the dredging, the marina itself, the locating of the building, the construction of the grid shell, as we call it, and all the panels being put in. That gives you a sense of scale of how large this is, this entire sort of envelope, and how it sits in relation to the building. And then every vertice or every moment of the diamond has one of these sort of strange-looking things on it. And these were two reasons. One was when I originally designed these moments of the glass, my original intention was that the glass would all move a little bit when the cars raced by. So I had this idea, and I discussed it with the Sheikh and also with Eldar, that if the cars were in fact digitized as the racing cars went by, we could make the skin quiver and kind of shiver. Beautiful idea until they saw the numbers, and they said, no, we're not going to spend money on that, so that's out. But we kept another idea, which was part of it, which was that each of these vertices would have a video projector on them. So each of those is one video projector that would project a 30 million color array onto the glass, which became really important for events, as you know, when they have the races and the light that moves over the building and so on. The bridge itself was built outside of England in the ports and shipped in 3 pieces to Abu Dhabi because it couldn't sit on the track. The track was being tested for the race because it was so quick. So it was built in parts and brought over. That's how it looks now. And it produces a very beautiful public space that in fact sits right over the racetrack between turns 6, 7, and 8. And the building, again, is a place. It's a place of well known now in Abu Dhabi. It's part of the cultural and tourism aspects of the city. It's both a marina and a place for circuit racing, as well as cycling now and other sports. And a destination, and I think that was key. But all the while, the level, and this is really important for us in our work, is that the level of abstraction in this building is what I believe allows it to continue to be contemporary and continues to allow it to not be dated and not be sort of a certain era, a certain time. There's a longevity in looking towards abstract, non-symbolic gestures in architectural making. Here you can see some of the other images of it, and the moment of the turn of the cars through these 2 loops. And here you can see the facade as it changes in color and light throughout the night, because as the moment that the lighting of the sky starts to change, the computers kick in and the digital files start getting sent over the facade as a kind of an atmospheric envelope that lights up the building. And another building in the same spirit of sort of making place, but also environmental let's say, sensitivity, was our proposal for the Dubai Expo for the pavilion, the main pavilion at the Dubai 2020 Expo. This building is designed around the mathematics and architecture of a shell, which is found in all aspects of nature and so on. And then a series of these sort of almost landscape elements that spiral up through the building that produce its kind of interior court and its interior space. But what was key to this building was a development with structural engineers, again in Stuttgart, of a solar skin, pneumatic solar skin envelope that we're trying to develop with them for the center of the building. And what I mean by that is that central piece structurally is meant to be a highly efficient absorber of solar energy as well as transmitter of light. And that's really the sort of idea behind it. I don't know if you can see that slide. It's kind of hard. It's kind of washed out. And here you can see the sort of idea that these buildings sit around this sort of heat sink, which in fact eliminates all the hot air out of the building through these PVC panels. And at the bottom, what you're seeing there are cisterns for the natural air conditioning of the building. So the whole building is built on 6 meters of water of cisterns, which has a naturally cooling effect that's brought back up to the ground. So you can see here the PVC panels, but also all the paving was designed to be also energy efficient, energy-driven paving. By people walking on it produces electricity and energy. And then all the groundscape would sort of bring up this cool air from the cisterns below the building and produce these public fountains and public spaces and these naturally ventilated and naturally cooled air-conditioned environments without any energy costs whatsoever, by virtue of just moving water in the ground the way it's been done forever. And finally, the last project to talk about is this idea of visionary planning. So to bring in all of those aspects together into a master plan and into city design was something that we decided to try and put into into sort of effect here. We worked on a project in Changsha, China. As you know, China is developing very fast, building cities at a rapid pace, but also has serious problems with pollution, congestion, population, and so on. So the idea here right away was to produce an energy sustainable, energy efficient, a place of contemporary habitation and contemporary urbanism. And to do that as a kind of prototype for China that could in fact become much larger. And the proposal that's been made to Changsha is that this city here in the Hunan province, because of its location and its proximity to the world really, becomes a kind of important place to produce a prototype city that could in fact influence much larger cities. So the proposal started with the idea of removing all automobiles, all fossil fuel vehicles, and producing a kind of transport system. And this harkens back to an era when we used to look at these as a potential way around the problem. In this case, what makes hyperloops and monorail systems more efficient is in fact now the auto drive computing and artificial intelligence has changed the nature of that subject. The city plan itself, and this is a city for about 100,000, so it's a small town in China, as a prototype, is centered entirely around pedestrian, bicycle, and independent automated vehicle movement. And that the main driver for producing the humanistic, qualitative aspects of this place is water. Water being brought in from the main rivers that are nearby, and then, much like in the Yaz Marina, brought in and produce a series of artificial water elements. So you can see here, all the housing is placed on water islands. The recreation centers are in the main kind of lake area, and then there's a recreation center at the top, and on the upper right are offices and incubators and so on. And then the other aspect, of course, is a planting strategy, so that the entire urbanism starts with a notion about transportation and movement. Then you layer onto that the notion of a kind of oxygenation, of clean, of sort of aspects that water bring, both a pleasure aspect as well as a kind of physical aspect and visual. And then, of course, parks and planting. And all of that is centered around this master plan of recreational areas, a creative industrial hub, sort of recreational zones, commercial zones, and so on. And the key, because it's a city from zero, was to sort of look at it a little bit like we look at designing products and technologies. So the entire subterranean of this city is a hyperloop system for the transport of goods, the removal of waste, the movement of people. So the entire circuitry, let's say, under the buildings takes away a lot of the issues we have with contemporary cities, and that are in fact what makes cities sometimes difficult. So all the congesting elements, all the things that have to be transported in and out, and all the things that have to move quickly and efficiently are put underground. And then the buildings themselves, and we're working on 2 prototypes of these buildings with other clients, are these ideas of personal delivery systems. So what used to be in buildings, the idea of the core and the heating and ventilation, now enters into the world of robotics, and the ability to, in fact, have robots inside your buildings that will do everything from changing your light bulbs to delivering packages, and so on. It's kind of an interesting idea that you hear robots in your walls, but they'll get around it. And then the notion of bringing interactive surfaces. Again, the efficiency of moving things like waste and issues within the housing, and that the housing itself is rapid prototyping, 3D printing, and prefabrication, and that there's an ability to sort of what we call plug and play, where you could have a home, take it out when it's obsolete, and the new one gets plugged in, and designing buildings around that. So this is the
Thank you.
This is the end of the talk, and the film that we produced just to show you the whole experience of this Changsha urbanism. This is it. Just let me finish this.
All right.
So maybe I can fast forward through some of this. You'll see here in the beginning I'll let it play. Can I go forward a little bit? Okay. I don't know if I can control, oh, here it is. Okay, let me just move past this. So this is the sketch as we talked about it, the different zones, the housing zone, the industrial zone, this is the industrial zone there, retail, commercial, entertainment, and all of this being held together by a circulatory system of sort of different levels of movement. Let's fast forward here because I know we're running out of time. Oh, it's a PC, it doesn't want to work with me. Okay. If you have patience, we'll just let it run. So here's the idea of the green carpet that runs through the city, the water features and elements, the various zones, the zoning of it, the different identities that the districts have according to their architectural interventions. And you'll see in a moment the main thoroughfares that connect this city to other cities around the world, in fact, and then the actual circulation system within the city, the minor systems, and then all the auto drive mechanisms that take people from their homes to the different aspects. And the exciting part is now. Here it goes. Just give it, because we actually get to sort of fly through the place a little bit.
We have about 5 minutes.
Okay. There we see the bike paths and the various pieces. So that basically is the blueprint for a carbon zero prototype city as we see it. You can see here in the three-dimensional animation the various components, and now we'll sort of come down to where the main circulatory monorail system is running, the maglev system that goes through, connects all these buildings at this point. You can see the smaller vehicles below, and then as we zoom out, we see the sort of quality of the plug-and-play prefab buildings against these are the incubator buildings in the park. This is a little bit like a kind of computer park. You can see the intermingling of various sort of autonomous vehicles with parks. But the interesting thing about this city is that there's no, you can see the amount of asphalt and stone that's been eliminated. And in fact, it's mostly green and water. So it's really the kind of old ideal of living in nature, and that nature becomes a kind of seriously celebrated part of it. You can see the existing road systems that connect to the buildings. This is the monorail system taking us past the commercial center, past the convention center. All the roofs, in fact, are solar, PV solar roofs. And then we get to sort of zoom out and see the end of it here. And now we're actually going through the retail zone, and you can see how much of this has been brought in and out. And the incorporation of so much parkland creates a very different atmosphere for the sort of quality of life and the quality of space here, in terms of producing, I think, a very human place for China. And here we are down at the marina, and now we're on the, you can see also the wind, all the wind aspects for picking up energy wherever we can throughout the entire project. Now we see the marina and the kind of recreation hub of the city. This is one of the hotels that they're building now. And then this is a recreation park here in this old salt mining pit that kind of goes down into that space and produces a series of museums and gathering places that's the sense of place. And finally, as we zoom out, we see the quality. And the interesting thing about this whole story is that when we finished designing this, we were quite happy. We went back to New York with our whole team. A lot of our team was from Silicon Valley and from California as well. And we got a call 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks after we finished the proposal, and we were told that the boss, the man in charge, loved the project. It was really beautiful, but he didn't think it looked like a city, and cities should look like cities. And I said, what does a city look like? And he said, Chicago. I said, okay, we give up. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. في الأول أحب أشكر صاحب السمو الملكي الأمير سعود بن خالد الفيصل نائب أمير منطقة المدينة المنورة على سعة الصدر والانتظار لساعة كاملة. كان حول للإنجليزي. I want to thank you, Professor Hani, for an incredible, powerful and poetic, profound presentation. You walked us through a journey of your marvelous projects. Professor Hani touched on 5 main aspects of architecture and urban design and humanizing the city. The first one related to edge making, and the second one about culture, and the third one, if I remember, about form giving, and the fourth about place making, and the fifth one we just seen about visionary planning. And it's an incredible journey for Professor Hani, and I don't want to go into details of what he showed us today, and I will leave the time for you to ask a few questions because we already took 1 hour. So I would take some questions from Professor Tashkandi. Go ahead.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. For sure, I am amazed by the architectural project that you present to us. I know nobody can question that. But I'm talking from the urban point of view and the housing point of view. I think if you compare this to what Le Corbusier proposed in 1920 to Paris, I don't see that much difference. It looks the same, and it was criticized at that time. If you take and I give you an example to see how is it human or not. If you measure the gross density, you will find it very low, which is within the standard of any housing standard. But if you take the net density, you will find it maybe 50 times higher than the public density or the general density. So this will give you an indication that it is not designed for human. It will work, people will live, but you will find a lot of problem in terms of protecting kids, children, and you know now this century is not like 100 years ago. There is a lot of social problem, drugs, and.
Can I ask you a question? Are you implying that? I'm just curious because that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
That you're saying that density means security?
Yeah, for sure. Yes. Yeah. You have
not in New York. I'll tell you that.
For New York is a disaster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because of density.
Yeah, but what you have a lot of green area.
Yeah.
If you distribute this green area to the people and to the residents, first of all, you could have dropped the maintenance cost. And instead of you drop that to the public, you will give that to the population. So instead of they will live in a box in the 10th floor, they will live in ample space, and the kids will find the green area, and you will find you can create a social environment. But for sure, you elevated all this building in high rise, and you made a big public space, which is very difficult to maintain, very difficult to defend, and to protect.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
Point well taken. I agree. Let me just say one thing, though, that's been interesting in the last few years, and it's something that I'm very much focused on. I didn't show any of the academic work I'm doing in Vienna, but it's something that's really important to us. What's happened is a lot of the, let me start another way. Throwing out older, avant-garde, radical models by virtue of the fact that they didn't work in their manifestation and therefore should not be looked at today is absolutely wrong. There is a lot today, we've noticed it in a lot of places. The advent of computerization, I talked about a little bit before, automation in driving, intelligence and systems ranging from waste removal to data management to understand city growth, to understand things like density and crime. Technology is enabling us now to look at these models a little bit, to revisit some of them and say, you know what, they were ahead of their time. Some of these models were ahead of the curve, and maybe should be looked at again just in terms of what we have today as enabling tools. Another example is the work in the 60s in Japan by the metabolists, which was based on prefabrication, based on sort of what they couldn't imagine, which we can do today, which is robotic construction and other things. And those models are being revisited also by certain people by virtue of the fact that maybe now we can do what was more of a dream in reality. You know, throwing out Plan Voisin, Garden City, you know, Radial City, I will go further even into Peter Cook's world of sort of moving cities and so on, is completely misguided. Those radical projects were done by very important, deep thinking architects. And in the sense, and when you're in that mode of thinking in a visionary way, and that's why I talked about it as visionary planning, this wasn't master planning or economically driven planning. This is the idea of having a vision. This vision for Changsha was a revisiting of the Garden City ideals and others. But given the fact that today people can call up a vehicle on their phone and go downstairs and it's waiting for them to take them somewhere, that the waste management again and the food delivery services are done in an automated and efficient way, that data is being used in some interesting way. That proposal, and I know where you're coming from, and I'm not in complete disagreement with you, but I had that big argument in Moscow with the same project against an American, not a Russian, who was one of the heads for Google planning for smart city projects. And the smart city guys, and that's what we have to be careful about, we being architects interested in humanizing cities, are not interested in this stuff at all. It's all a matter of where the data can take us in terms of producing a more efficient place to live. But efficiency doesn't necessarily mean pleasure, it doesn't necessarily mean health, and it doesn't necessarily mean safety, quite frankly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We'll take in point, Professor Slafildi. Okay, we'll take one questions. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for a breathtaking kind of session. I'm here, just in front of you, right here. I have a question for you. Basically, you have to do a lot of readings to orient yourself with the project that you're going to do, according to the location and the place and the function. But I want to just take you a little bit at the beginning. What are the kinds of the cultural readings that you have to do? What are the artifacts that you have to look at? Especially if we're wanting to have a project that is presenting a certain era or presenting a certain culture, and that is what we're trying to do here in Medina. So what is your advice, or let me say, if you were asked to make a project here, what are the things that you have to look at to represent the identity of the place? Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, that's a question that's dear to my heart. I think that in some ways, I'll just quickly say that when I was a younger architect, I was very jealous of architects who lived in cities, grew up in cities, and worked in cities, knew all the politicians, knew all the businessmen, and got lots of projects, because I had all the opposite. Because of an Egyptian father, British mother, growing up in Canada, Britain, and America, and Europe, put me in a very strange mindset. And also, as a child, I think I lived in 14 cities by the time I was 12 or something crazy. So what I think about a lot is exactly that dynamic of being from nowhere and being from everywhere. Being sort of nomadic, but at the same time locating yourself deeply in a place. Trying to assimilate, but at the same time looking at it from the outside. And I think that provides, I think we would all it would serve us all very well, even if we are locals who grew up somewhere and have always known it from one point of view, have outsiders like me come in and say something crazy. But I think that it behooves us, I guess, it's important to even be inside, to look from the outside and try and figure out what is going on and what is interesting. And so in that spirit, a big part of what I do, and I say a lot around the office, and we do a lot in our work, is I use this idea of extracting the DNA of place. But the extraction of DNA of place can come from literature, from local art, from local food, from rituals, from not just from the styles of the architecture. That tends to have been the problem. Architects say, oh, you know, they use this kind of stone here. If I put this kind of stone in my building, it's going to look local. If I put this kind of opening in my building, it's going to look local. And that has nothing to do with it. And we see it all the time. We see some, and I'm not going to mention any architects by name, but there are a lot of buildings done by Western architects, especially in this region, that don't work. But they may have all the right materials, but they're not looking at the cultural nuances. And I will say, that the Yaz Hotel, the thing I'm the most proud about with the Yaz Hotel, more than anything else, not the technology or the timeline or the cost, we kept it and all that business, was that when we opened it, the first thing that happened was the Abu Dhabi newspaper, the main newspaper, the national there, put a picture on the cover, had the 3 top sheikhs of the region standing there saying, this is our architecture. And I was thrilled to see that because my father told me when I was 16 years old thinking about becoming an architect, said, if you ever work in that region, don't do what all these Western architects are doing. And he showed me a picture of an early SOM building in Dubai. He said, you have to understand cultures to work in anywhere. And so I think it's important.
2 more questions? Okay. The lights are glaring in my eyes, I'm not seeing, but if I just can, okay. Before I give you the floor, I want to say maybe we can call your architecture as the architecture of the nomad. So يعني هذه عمارة البدو الحديثة. إذا الدكتور تشخدي بيطالع فيها معترض على التسمية بالعربي. تفضل دكتور.
Thank you, Hani. Thank you, President. Did you hear about the Saudi Arabia plan, strategic plan for 2030 to having the NEOM project, the NEOM project?
I'm sorry.
NEOM. The future.
Oh, no. I heard something. In fact, I was reading about it. My partner sent me something in
Actually, it's the
futuristic kind of.
It's similar to the last project you present. Did you think it will be applicable to the Saudi society to adopt similar projects for the near future within the next 10 years?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what was really important about that project, and you know, just to answer the question that was thrown at me at the beginning, what was really important about that project was not, had I wanted the commission, had we wanted the job, I wouldn't have done that. But what was really important was putting together a number of experts, some people I had met in academic circles, as well as some friends and some people working in technology, and saying, you know, if we put the right people in the mix, because as an architect, what's maybe different than what was referred to in the older version of visionary planning, was that I see myself as part of a group of experts to do these kinds of projects. Because the people that we brought over from Silicon Valley were part of auto drive systems, Cisco systems. There were some guys there from Microsoft. There were people who never did architecture or cities, but as part of a group could help me understand how we could produce a city. And what was amazing about that project is that it's extremely, because it's a prototype, it's extremely buildable and doable. And a lot of the technology in there is technology we have today. So the difference in making a visionary project about saying, oh, let's do something that maybe will be built 50 years from now, was the statement there was, let's do something that looks like it might be built 50 years from now, but built today with the technologies we have at our disposal.
One last quarter of a minute.
Professor Hani, I really enjoyed your talk, and I am from NEOM. I'm the Executive Director for Strategic Partnerships, and I very much enjoyed your presentation, and I just wanted to let you know that I really felt synergetic with the vision that you presented, and I'd like to speak to you after this.
Shukran. Thank you.
With this comments, we would like to conclude our session. I would like to thank His Excellency, the chairperson, Dr. Adnan Adas, and of course, we will extend our appreciation and gratitude to Engineer Hani Rashid for being with us at this session. Thank you very much, gentlemen.